And I know Mahmood, because you're from Ohio State, and we've talked about this before. Arjun, would you feel comfortable just introducing yourself briefly, and so we kind of know who you are and what your interest is in the topic before we get going?
Yeah, so I'm a second-year resident at the Cleveland Clinic Foundation. I'm interested in pursuing gastroenterology and then hopefully either medical pancreatology or advanced endoscopy fellowship. I've spent a couple of years at Mayo Clinic with Dr. Shaunak Majumdar, who is a pancreatologist there in Rochester doing research. I'm interested in the CAPER Scholars Program, and then also interested in learning about how to perform research using EPIC, since we at the Cleveland Clinic use EPIC.
Awesome. Well, we'll definitely cover hopefully some of that. Glad to hear you were able to work with Dr. Majumdar up at the Mayo Clinic. I've only met him a couple times at conferences. Seems like a really great guy, and seems like a great mentor as well.
Yeah, definitely. And then currently I'm working with Dr. Chahal. I'm not sure if you know her.
Yeah.
And then Tyler Stevens too.
Yeah. It seems as though the Cleveland Clinic has such a large clinical enterprise that it can be challenging to do work with residents for really mentoring through research. Although Tyler Stevens and Prableen Chahal are both excellent. So you've got a really great team. But I would encourage you, and I'm happy to help in any way we can with the CAPER Scholars Program.
Thank you.
All right, we got a couple more people logged in now, so I will just jump into the content. I'm Mitch Ramsey. I'm the lead of the CAPER Young Investigator Program. As you all may be aware, CAPER stands for the Collaborative Alliance for Pancreas Education and Research. And really our mission is to equip, the young investigator in particularly, equip younger junior trainees with the tools and resources they need to be successful in the field of pancreas, whatever that looks like, whether that's medical pancreatology, gastroenterology, peds GI, endocrine, surgery. I'm an adult gastroenterologist, so that's sort of where my bias comes in. And so I kind of look at things through that lens. But if you're interested in the field, I would encourage you to take a look at the CAPER Scholars Program. I think this is really one of the best ways that we're able to accomplish the mission of CAPER, and that is by getting folks who are interested in pancreas, but maybe at an institution where there aren't senior pancreas mentors. And this connects you with senior mentors across the country, and sort of helps you get your foot in the door in the field of pancreas. So quick plug on that. And now we will, if I can advance my slides, jump into a brief introduction about planning a retrospective study, and then I'll turn it over to Dr. Farrell for the remainder of the session. But I just wanted to talk a little bit about some of the planning step before Dr. Farrell tells us about the specific tools. So I have a couple take-home points that I just want to plant in your brain right out the gate. I'll start by saying that most retrospective studies can only report correlation, not causation. So by their design, they are hypothesis generating, but they're not exactly able to definitively prove or disprove a hypothesis in terms of a cause-effect relationship. The next take-home point is that a thoughtful clinical question and a well-designed statistical approach is critical for the success of retrospective studies. One specific tool that can be used for retrospective studies are administrative claims databases. And these facilitate studies with large power, lots of numbers, and allows you to do multivariable models and subset analyses, but they don't capture necessarily all the data points that you might want. And that's where looking at medical record retrospective studies kind of comes in. When done well, retrospective studies can produce impactful manuscripts, and they provide preliminary data for future prospective or interventional studies. Of all these, what I'd like to spend the most time in my couple minutes talking about is developing a thoughtful clinical question. And then Dr. Farrell can talk a little bit about the tools, and hopefully you have partnership at your institutions who can kind of help you work through the statistical approach. But all these three things are critical for the success of a retrospective study. This is a high-level overview of what it takes to do a retrospective study. We'll be talking about the first 5 tonight. and that is to develop a clinical question, present it in a testable format, scrutinize the measures of this testable format, and sort of list out any potential confounders. The next step is to compare your list of required data points to available data sets, which may include administrative claims or may be in your medical record. And lastly, for our session tonight, you'll select a database and collaborate with others who have expertise in this database. So a little bit about forming a good clinical question. One technique that I like for this is called the FINER test. And I was introduced to this concept by Dr. Conwell, who brings this up every time he hears a project proposal. He kind of lists them out on his fingers. Is it feasible, interesting, novel, ethical, and relevant? And it's a very simple tool, but really clarifies whether or not a study ought to be done, because it can refine what you're looking at. So you can read through these. There's some feasibility questions. Can this question be answered with the reported variables and outcomes? Are there important confounding variables that cannot be controlled? Is it interesting? So if your study goes well, will it actually be interesting to readers? Will it change management? In terms of novelty, has the topic been explored previously? Will it advance the field in some way? Ethical, is there a possibility of harm to participants? I also added a bullet point, could the study be construed in a way that reinforces harmful biases or stereotypes about patient populations? And then lastly, is it relevant? If this publishes, will the findings impact patient management? And that's really what we're trying to do with all of our research. Once you've come up with a broad topic that meets those FINER criteria, the next step is to present your idea in a testable format. And so I have two examples here from projects that I've worked on in the past. And we'll just kind of walk you a little bit through my thought process and kind of how they shaped into the projects they became. The first one was related to CFTR modulators and the GI tract. And the question really is, do these drugs affect the GI tract? And that's sort of the broad topic. But you can see that it's hard to answer that as a yes or no. And so you have to be a little bit more specific. So the next level of specificity is to say, among patients with cystic fibrosis, does treatment with CFTR modulators change measurements of GI function? But again, you have to be even more specific with what are those measurements? Is there a way to incorporate a control group? Is there a testable hypothesis within that theme? And so the next level of refining is among patients with CF and available data before and during CFTR modulator treatment. So there you have a intervention and a historical control. Does treatment reduce hospitalizations for acute pancreatitis? And here you have a measurable outcome, 2 time periods that you can compare. And we ran this one through MarketScan, and we were able to publish it. Similar spin on the same broad format, same broad, theme is among patients with CF and available data before and during CFTR modulator treatment. Does treatment reduce the incidence of cirrhosis or the incidence of decompensation events? So it's another outcome measure that is in the broad category of GI function, but is specific to a different organ system. And I'll skip over the next one because I think you get the deal of how to ask a broad question and refine it in a more testable way. One key thing that will come up is to be very specific in what are your outcome measures. So for example, I should say your outcome measures in all of your other variables and confounders. In retrospective studies, oftentimes you have to rely on something that's coded in some way, or the data is stored somewhere in some format. Oftentimes this means you have to go hunt for it using ICD-9 or 10 codes or procedure codes or something like that. And so it is important, I think, at the outset to look at that case finding strategy that you use and make sure that it's valid and it has good sensitivity and specificity, and there's not a systematic bias just in your case finding, because that's going to be very challenging to fix on the back end statistically if you add a bias right out the gate in your case finding. Similar with comorbidities, intervention, different outcome measures, comparison groups. It's important at the outset to define what these are and come up with good, rigorous ways of measuring those and making sure that your measurement will pass muster when it comes to peer review. There are a number of administrative claims databases which have a variety of these data points. I won't go through that in detail. But lastly, once you've done all of this and you've picked your variables, the next step is to select a database and collaborate with others who have expertise in this database. This may look like reviewing PubMed for other high-impact publications from your database. And really, you're not looking at the topic or the content so much, but you really want to scrutinize their methods. So what statistical analyses were used? What specific variables did they include? How did they handle those? And were they able to generate good data out of that data set? And then you have to say, can I fit my question into their methods? Or is it similar enough that we can do this? I just did this week. We're doing a systematic review of pooled prevalence and was running into issues with how we define or how we rate the quality of our included studies. And so I just went to Web of Science and you sort the papers by either their impact or the number of citations. And so it'll give you a number of papers that look at what you're looking for. They have something like 3,000 citations. So you know that it's interesting or that it's a good one. And then you can flip through that to pick out their methods and come up with a rigorous methodology. The other way to do it is to collaborate with content area experts. So this might be specialists in your area, at least your medical field, or with methods experts, and these might be biostatisticians. I made a bigger bullet point here. Be prepared to implement some changes, maybe some major changes to your study plan after discussing with these experts. It's often they want to change some of the variables, or they want to change the design in a way that makes your original study framework not work quite as well. So be prepared to reevaluate at that time. I also included a quote here from Carl Sagan. It says, every scientist feels a proprietary affection for his or her ideas and feelings. Even so, the hard but just rule is that if the ideas don't work, you must throw them away. And this is true of retrospective studies because the data is all there. You just have to find it when you have a good question to ask of it. So if you don't have a good question, don't go hunting for the data because you won't be producing a meaningful manuscript. So again, these are my take-home points. And I hope I've shared a little bit about forming a good clinical question. And with this, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Peter Farrell, and he will share a little bit with us about some methodology specific to using the electronic medical record to generate data for retrospective studies. So Dr. Farrell, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, thank you very much. Hopefully, I'm going to share my screen and we'll jump in. So do you guys see my slides okay there?
Yeah, that looks great.
All right, perfect. So I'm Peter Farrell. I am a pediatric gastroenterologist here at Cincinnati Children's, and I came by an interest in gastroenterology kind of the old-fashioned way, and resisted it fiercely. So my father is also a gastroenterologist, and kind of nudged me along the whole way that I was going to become a GI doc as well. And I said, definitely not. No question, I was going to do something different. And then, sure enough, when I was in residency, I got interested in the idea of different fluid choices. You guys in the adult world were a little bit ahead of us in terms of how to choose kind of fluids and that sort of stuff. And but it was my first kind of foray into retrospective studies. And so using a FIS database, which is a different kind of database. We're not really going to talk about a lot here today, but it's a large pediatric specific health information database that it kind of combines some of the major pediatric institutions across the country, and has a significant amount of billing data. And once you apply and get access to the database, you can actually do a lot of different queries. And so, so we looked at that, and we looked at whether lactated ringers compared to normal saline really had any effect. And what we found in again with some of the caveats of these larger database studies, that that kids who received exclusively LR had an overall shorter length of stay than the patients who received normal saline. So it doesn't talk about kind of any of the other aspects of that, but it was a kind of significant study. And so this was, I think, my very first publication in fellowship, and it was something I was very, very excited about. So but then we're going to kind of pivot more to the local level, and think more about kind of how things work in Epic, and how this came to pass for me. And I will confess, I have done some computer coding in my background, that sort of stuff, but my first exposure to Epic, I think, given the opportunity, I would have kind of thrown it off the hospital roof, because it was just a very frustrating kind of system to work with. And I was talking to one of our informaticians about that, and he said, "Well, listen, you can throw it off the roof, or you can buy it a beer, and you can kind of learn to work with it a little bit better." And so I took that kind of challenge, and I said, this is the old model of how we kind of approach Epic. Was an IT guy would come over and say, "Hey, listen, all these sound like great projects, but we don't have time to customize for every specialty. So you just have to kind of take what's available." And on our side, we're saying, no matter what we ask for, it could be the easiest thing in the world. It's taking 2 to 6 months. And so, and things just don't line up. And even when they do line up, you finally get someone to build a project with you, and it still takes 5 to 6 months to get anything done. And at the end of it, you're like, you know what, I'm kind of over this project. I just need to get it done. And so you just kind of accept a imperfect project and move on. And so Epic and several institutions, and I believe Ohio State does this as well, sponsored what are called physician builders. And so so now within the Epic framework, clinicians can actually become themselves actually builders within Epic, and get access to some of the kind of behind the scenes code and nuts and bolts of Epic to do some building projects. And so you can actually be that kind of go-between and actually kind of build out some stuff. And so anyway, so over the course of about a year or so, I did a couple different kind of physician builder courses through Epic. When you become a physician builder, they send you this Leatherman, which I'm not really sure why, but I kind of really like it. And so, which maybe just is emblematic of how nerdy I am. But anyway, so that's a kind of thing. If you're interested, we can talk more about that some other time. And to kind of give a sense, this is what a kind of project behind the scenes might look like in Epic, of how to build a registry based on multiple kind of clinical factors. And this is important when we think about retrospective data analysis, because all of these pieces of data are available and are things that we could then go back and query and build out manuscripts based on. So kind of learning the nuts and bolts is actually helpful, or having someone who within your division who understands the nuts and bolts can be really helpful. And so here at Children's, and again, I think different hospitals do it differently, but getting this physician builder certification, to me, here at Children's, gives me access to kind of our proof of concept environment, which is basically a skeleton of Epic, and you can really build kind of anything you want. And also our shadow environments, which are called our SUP environments. And so those are literal copies of the Epic production, but they are staggered by some interval of time. So a week, 30 days, something along those lines, depending on which one you're looking at, so that you can actually play with real patient data when you're trying to run some of these searches or build out some of these projects. Without screwing up anybody's chart or making any permanent changes to the actual Epic framework. And then once these things are kind of built out, you can move them over into the production environment. And so, so what? So like, why care about kind of physician builder kind of stuff? And the reason is because it allows for us to dig in on an almost on a really kind of individualized basis into the data within Epic. And so we're going to talk a lot about kind of how to pull out retrospective data and that sort of stuff, but also just how you can better utilize and how people within your division can better utilize Epic for your own purposes. And so, so you can build out custom registries, smart phrases, dashboards, the research projects, that sort of stuff that we're talking about on a retrospective standpoint, but also prospectively. And you can help with things like resident and fellow engagement by looking at actual data utilization within Epic and where the clicks lost and that sort of stuff, where do the eyes go glassy and things along those lines. So there are quite a few tools kind of behind the scenes I think a lot of people aren't aware of. And so, and in full disclosure, this talk is going to continue to talk almost exclusively about Epic. And so apologies for anybody who is on the call that might use Cerner. A lot of the stuff does overlap, but the language is different. So So some of you may know some of these pieces for those of you who use Epic and things along those lines. But this is kind of how the different kind of silos of data and how they exist within Epic. And so on the left here is Chronicles, which is what you think of on a daily basis when you log into Epic. This is where you actually are building out or are actually creating patient encounters and putting in patient data and things along those lines. And then behind the scenes, there are these two other kind of data silos, which are Caboodle and Clarity, based off of SQL or what's called the star schema database from Epic that are different kind of queryable databases that share a common universe, and that allows for non-clinical data to then be meshed in with clinical data, and then for reports to be built out. And so we're going to talk about some of these things, kind of a reporting workbench and Slicer Dicer, but the real difference between them is that reporting workbench is largely limited to information that is generated within Epic, whereas Slicer Dicer can incorporate information that is imported into Epic from external sources. So, and it gets into a little bit other kind of complicated stuff. And I promised I wasn't going to spend 4 hours talking about kind of Epic code and that sort of stuff. So we'll move on. But if you guys have questions at any point, please. So I'm not sure if this is helpful or not. It makes sense from my brain, but there are lots of different master files that stack up to create the data that you're looking at any given moment within an Epic chart. And so within, for example, a single patient's master file, there might be multiple sub files that are linkable and therefore searchable when you're thinking about retrospective data. And it can be as simple as just date of birth and other kind of demographic data, and you can actually do a lot of meaningful work with that. And so you might say, what could you do with just demographic information? And as it turns out, you can actually do quite a bit. And so this is a study that we did where we looked at the deprivation index of patients who use telehealth for access to clinic versus the patients who came in person during the initial COVID-19 shutdown. And so what we did is we looked at that kind of first month where everything was super surreal, and all of a sudden we kicked everyone out of clinic in person, and we said, what is, can we use our Epic data to figure out who was able to actually get their appointment done in telehealth versus people who insisted on coming in person versus people who weren't able to get their appointments completed at all. And so had some criterias, kind of baseline samples and definitions. And this was what Mitchell's kind of talking about in terms of coming up with good questions and specific kind of examples of data that you want to compare. And then using very simple, this is just an example of some R coding that and outputs. So doing some very simple calculations based off of exported data from Epic, you're able to then do a high level comparison and find some pretty significant differences here. And so, and again, this is all based off of a single kind of data point, which is addresses and how those can relate to things like deprivation index. And so, and I'll show you what that means in a second. So deprivation index, for those of you guys who don't know what that is a 6-factor marker of patient relative prosperity based on census tract information. So it doesn't tell you anything about an individual, but it tells you about the community that individual is coming from and what the relative probability is that they have significant deprivation. So the higher the score, the more deprivation they have. And so using basically just that address and a calculator that is freely available on GitHub with a R pass-through, you can run this information through and get very meaningful data very quickly. And so what we found, not surprisingly, was that at our baseline, we had a pretty homogeneous group of, or a pretty heterogeneous group of patients who come to see us in clinic. But the telehealth patients were very significantly less deprived or came from less deprived environments. And the patients who ventured out during the pandemic actually were much more deprived than our kind of baseline. So not surprising at all. And you can also use that same data to kind of create maps of meaningful information. And so we can see that what we found was that patients who were doing telehealth were really clustered in our urban environments, whereas we normally pull from pretty significant kind of rural areas. So, and this all goes back to the same simple concept of a patient master file pulling exclusively the patient's demographic data and their address, and then running it through a filter. So then the next piece that I wanted to kind of talk about that you guys have probably seen before is this feature called a reporting workbench. A lot of times fellows or at least at our institution.
Do you mind if I interrupt you for a quick question?
Yeah, go ahead.
So that last project is like totally fascinating to me, that you were able to ask a question and very quickly, almost in real time, be able to access this massive amount of data and answer your question, which has both research and maybe clinical implications. Tell me, when you were going to like get that data in the spreadsheet on the previous slide, like even with addresses, was that something where you had to like get an IRB, go through like a data warehouse to download it? Or is it more of a, tell me about that.
Yeah, so it's a good question. So this, so yeah, we did have to have an IRB, but it's and kind of you kind of covered this a little bit in your opening slides as well, but relatively straightforward IRB. There's no consent required. It doesn't rise to the level of patient research. So there's no consent required and things along those lines, or I'm sorry, human subject research. So there's no consent required. And so it's relatively, the IRB was, went through, we got the letter of exemption, I think in 5 or 6 days. So it was very quick. And as you said, it was almost in real time that we were able to kind of pull out this data. And then once we had the IRB approval, pulling this data together took a matter of, honestly, just took an hour on a higher end computer upstairs to run the GitHub pass through to get the deprivation index, because it has to do all those calculations at the same time. But you could do it on your laptop. It would just take like 3 or 4 hours. And so it does not require a tremendous amount of computing power necessarily, but it does take a while to kind of do all those calculations, but less than a day. So this was one of our current fellows who was a resident at Children's at the time. She became the first author on this and kind of cranked it out of 2020, and when she started fellowship in July. And so so it was a very quick and easy project to do. So, but yeah, and this is kind of the point, is that all of this is sitting there in Epic and ready to roll, and you can export it from Epic directly into either Excel or a CSV file, depending on what you want to run. And then you can do some very simple, and I will tell you, I do a lot of my own statistics, but then I don't trust myself, so I have a statistician kind of double check me. And so, but I write a lot of my own code in R or GitHub, and then I send it to Lindsay, is our statistician, and she's kind of a badass. And so I'll send stuff over to her and say, hey, this is what I found. Can you double check it for me? But I could do one of these projects, like you said, almost in real time on a couple of admin days if you have if you have a good question to start with.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. Super excited. So thanks for letting me interrupt you with a question. I'm looking forward to hearing more about how to implement this.
Yeah, and then and and so that's the other thing, guys. If you have questions about how to actually roll any of this stuff out within your own Epic, just let me know, and we can kind of talk about that stuff in more detail. I was trying to make this more kind of practical, like things that I've actually done, and then kind of talk about how to do them. But if you have questions about how to do things within your own institution or tangentially related stuff, just shout it out. Don't be shy. So this is, again, is kind of the reporting workbench, which you probably have seen a lot of times. At least our institution fellows will run this to kind of keep track of their procedures and things along those lines. And it's relatively, again, available out of the box, but people don't necessarily realize how customizable reporting workbench is. And so if we go back to the data standpoint, literally anything from Chronicles can be searched for in a reporting workbench. And so one project that one of our advanced endoscopists had asked me to kind of help with was he wanted to see how many patients had suspected autoimmune pancreatitis on imaging that he then would go through it and biopsy. And so he knew all the kids that he had biopsied. That was, again, a relatively easy report for him to run, but he was very kind of stuck with how to find patients who had suspected autoimmune pancreatitis on imaging. And as it turns out, within Epic, there are you can actually build a reporting workbench that looks for specific keywords within either an impression or the narrative summary of image results. And so, and again, very simply, you can run these things. They do take a while to actually kind of run the actual report, but you can get real-time data, and I can, and by having it pass through me, I can de-identify it before I send it over to the team that's ultimately going to kind of publish it and that sort of stuff. But otherwise, you do need some sort of checks and balances to protect kind of HIPAA and that sort of stuff. But otherwise, it is very, very simple to do a lot of these things. And I think a lot of projects die on fellows' tongues because they think it's impossible to get to this data. And it turns out that with not a lot of effort, it's actually very easy. And so that's a good example of that. And then Slicer Dicer, I think, is the one that has probably gotten the most press. People have talked a lot about it. It's not always my favorite tool, but I think it has some real life utility. And again, I can't speak to other institutions, but here all the fellows and faculty have access to Slicer Dicer and can play around with it anytime they want to. And so within Slicer Dicer, you can start with your kind of population. So the first thing you do is define your population, and the slices are the subpopulations that you want to look at in more detail. And so, what information do you want? And this is kind of those secondary questions that you were asking about, Mitchell, and how do you kind of identify them? And then what do you want from it? Do you just want a trend, a graph? Do you want you want the actual patient's names? What is it that you're actually looking for? So this was a very simple hepatitis C graph, and just looking at our overall numbers and within our institution, and then how they have started to fall again with the introduction of the antiretroviral or antiviral therapies to the pediatric population about 3 years ago now. So, but you can track it based on age of the patient and year of diagnosis and that sort of stuff. And then you can actually get by clicking on these chevrons, you can actually get very specific kind of patient data. So, and I think Mitchell, you and I had emailed about this one, but another question that had come up in the pediatric world was, what was the number of patients who have ALL who receive PEG asparaginase who develop acute pancreatitis? So what are those numbers? What are the characteristics of the patients? Is there enough there to even bother digging in? Is this, are you talking about 2 patients over the last kind of 5 years sort of thing? Or is there a good signal there? And so when a fellow comes to me, I can run some of these slicer dicer data very quickly. And before you even have IRB approval, you can actually run some of these searches as long as you don't get into the actual patient's charts and start looking at the patient data. You can actually start to get some preliminary information. And then, would this be enough that you could then springboard this into a prospective study in the future? Could you get enough information about the age of the patient, the dose per body surface area, things along those lines, and build a predictive model or use machine learning to help us kind of figure out which kid that comes in and gets PEG asparaginase is going to end up calling us, as they always do, at 3 a.m. with pancreatitis. They never call it 3 p.m. I don't know if that's true in the adult world as well, but in pediatrics, they never ever call it 3 o'clock in the afternoon.
Yeah, the adults really like weekends is the only difference, I think.
Yeah, that's fair. So then this is just kind of the last year, and I ended up running this over kind of multiple years and kind of proving the same thing. And this is what the literature had kind of suggested as well, was that that approximately kind of 10% of patients who receive PEG asparaginase will ultimately develop acute pancreatitis. And so that was the kind of the signal that we found, and it was kind of consistent over a year from year. And so you can see kind of this is how the population sorts out. And this is just a quick visual thing that I can show the team. Or once we have IRB approval, I can click on this chevron here, and we have all the patient data right there, and you can export it into Excel and go to work. Or you can go back into the reporting workbench and say, now I want to build out more columns. I want to get more data about the specific dose or the medication, things along those lines. And that there's going to be a signal there, and so you're not feeling like you're spinning your wheels and getting kind of nowhere. Questions about any of that stuff? All right, then the last one, that other big kind of data source within Epic that I think is worth kind of talking about from a retrospective kind of standpoint is something called Signal. And so this is user data. And so this is, if you're interested in quality improvement or workflow optimization or job satisfaction or really kind of any of those sorts of pieces, the Epic actually catalogs a lot of this information for us. And so it gives us kind of, I blacked out people's names so no one would be embarrassed, but it gives us, the individual attendings kind of proficiency scores and a bunch of other information. So like this value here is called pajama time, and I'll show you what that means in a second. But this is, when we talk about like having work-life balance, can you actually measure that in your fellows and in your residents and in your faculty? It turns out you can actually look at when people are logging on to Epic at 2 a.m. when they should be asleep, not when they're on call, but when they should be at home in bed, but instead they're logging on because they couldn't sleep because they wanted to check a lab result or things along those lines. And so then you could imagine a variety of different projects that you could build out from that to help kind of increase and improve optimization of care delivery. And so this is just kind of more of the information that is kind of hardwired into Epic, and you can customize it a little bit. But these are things like, you know, time spent in the in basket, which is my personal bane of my existence. I feel like I never get out of the in basket. How much time you spend in orders, things along those lines. How often you use orders from smart sets and things along those lines. So again, you could very easily see when thinking about quality improvement or things along those lines, how you could look at this data retrospectively and then design future interventions, or just characterize it and just say that, you know, comparing GI to pulmonary, for example, these are how we utilize things and how long we're spending writing notes and things along those lines. And so this is what I was kind of talking about. So this is not me, but sometimes this is my pattern as well. This is that kind of pajama time sort of flag. And so basically, you know, the computer says 7 to 5 is kind of is our work day. And so anything after 5 is considered after hours. And then anything from 8 p.m. to 6 a.m. is considered pajama time. And so you can see that this particular user, you know, goes home, sees his family, reads a story to his kids, and then gets back on Epic until 2 a.m, and then he goes to sleep and sleeps for 4 hours and gets up again. So you could easily see how this particular person is very well set up for kind of burnout and that sort of stuff. And by reducing some of these things, particularly when most of this is occupied by notes and catching up on documentation, things along those lines, you could potentially help improve worker satisfaction, but also you know, not have patients waiting for their notes and not have PCPs waiting for letters and things along those lines. So better care delivery, better job satisfaction, all that kind of stuff. So, and it's all just sitting there. It's all readily available. It's out of the box. There's nothing, you don't have to pay anything for it. It's all just kind of sitting there. And then if you look on here, there's this kind of download icon. And so you can actually pull this data at any point you want, and you can actually create pivot tables, and you can look at things. One of the things that our institution cares a lot about is encounters being open for more than 7 days. That's kind of that's where you get your hand slapped at 7 days and 1 hour. And so looking at, you know, if there's any kind of signal there about how you know, which providers are closing charts the fastest and things along those lines. So I think that was kind of the big kind of retrospective stuff that I wanted just to kind of highlight quickly. And then I just wanted a couple of words about some other pieces within Epic that you can build out retrospectively, and then you can design to then monitor prospectively. And so the two things are registries and dashboards. And so registries, as you guys may have seen before, are ways to organize subpopulations of patients, and they can look back kind of as far as you want, but they can also be used to identify patients who are lost to follow-up and use prospectively and things along those lines. So they can actually be the cornerstone of your research project, but also have meaningful application for patient engagement and appropriate kind of patient care. So it doesn't have to be one or the other. And so there are some, again, that are kind of out of the box. There's like a diabetes and hypertension ones that you can look at. We've built them at Children's now for things like celiac and IBD and our pancreatic team and that sort of stuff. So these are all very, very buildable, and they can, as I said, they look back, but you can also use them to look forward and to think about areas where things are not going well, and to identify patients that need interventions. And then similarly are things that like dashboards, and so I'm not sure if you guys use these already, but these are ways to to pick some metrics that you want to follow, and you can make these specific for each user. And again, you can look back. And so if you have an ongoing project where you're looking at, I don't know, rate of pancreatic cancer diagnoses or things along those lines, or adenocarcinoma identification, you can actually create on the homepage of Epic when you log in. You can create a report for yourself on your own dashboard that would have all of those patients kind of identified for you, so that you could see how many patients have been diagnosed in the last 2 months or whatever with a particular diagnosis. Then you can click on them and get more information. So, or you could use it to see, one of our big kind of watchwords in IBD is therapeutic drug level monitoring. So our IBD dashboard has a lot of drug levels and things along those lines. So you can see how many of your patients are meeting the target goals for the various drugs, and then think about how that how you can improve that, and which patients are falling short and things along those lines. So with that, I think I'm just about out of time. I saved a few minutes for discussion. These are my kids, so if I ever look tired, it's because of them, and if I ever look happy, it's because of them. So so that's I think I'll stop there and see if there's any questions.
While we're waiting on people to ask them, there were 2 that were entered in the chat from Arjun. The first one, did you need IRB approval for Slicer Dicer or for the reporting workbench? And I'll ask you, if you need it for Slicer Dicer, how do you put it in, or who do you tell that your IRB is approved?
Yeah, so this is a big kind of topic of discussion in our institution, because there's no hard stop between that last kind of click that I was showing you, where you create you can get the report and pull out all the patient's data. When you get the Slicer Dicer access, they kind of remind you that if there's not a clinical reason for you to be looking at a patient's chart, that you shouldn't use that last feature until you have IRB approval. And so so basically it's a little bit of an honor code sort of situation, but it's also you can't publish anything without having IRB approval. And so so I'm sure there are people out there who click on the chevron first and get the IRB approval a week later, things along those lines. But you do have to get the IRB approval if you're going to do any sort of meaningful work with the data. And also within our institution, our data scientists won't, or statisticians won't do anything with the data until they've seen the IRB approval and things along those lines. So you might have a list of patients, but you can't really do anything with the data until you have the formal IRB approval. But as I said, for us, that's usually very, very quick, because again, this is information that's just sitting out there, and you don't have to jump through a bunch of hoops. And it's not usually considered to be human subject research, because it's just readily available.
Awesome. And then he had also asked about, where do you do the EPIC courses? Is that through EPIC or through Cincinnati Children's?
No, yes. So it's through EPIC. So I don't know right now if they're going back to in person. It's worth, if you ever get the chance to, it's honestly worth going up to the the EPIC campus. It is bizarre in kind of an amazingly cool way, which makes sense because they're probably a multi-trillion-dollar company at this point. But they literally have built, each kind of building is around like different themes. Like there's like a Star Wars, they can't call it Star Wars, there's an outer space one, and like they can't call it Hogwarts, but it's like a fantasy one, and they have all these different like kind of crazy kind of themes that are kind of amazing and that sort of stuff. And then they have these classes which are actually free as long as you're sponsored by your institution to go there. So the only requirements are you have to be an MD or a DO, and your institution has to agree for you to to go take the classes, and they're free. You have to obviously pay for the flights and the hotel rooms and that sort of stuff when you're up there, but otherwise there's no cost for the classes. And And then for a while there, they were being offered online as well. And so then all you really had to do is have a kind of a week off. So each one of those kind of courses that I mentioned it takes about a week of work and then maybe a few extra days for the kind of capstone projects. But it's, again, this is not like coding boot camp. This is more just kind of a little bit of behind the scenes of Epic and a little bit more detail so you can use a little bit more.
And would you mind speaking a little bit as to like, where were you in your career path when you did the Epic Builder program?
Yeah, so I was and it was my last year of fellowship and my first year as faculty member, and that was part of my kind of arc was I knew that I want to stay in Cincinnati, as I might have mentioned. My family's here. My wife is also a physician, and she's on faculty at Children's, and so I was really wanted to stay here, and so I needed to help kind of find a niche that I could occupy. And I had already started having interest from other projects of doing more kind of data science sort of stuff. And I was working on my master's at the time in clinical research, and so I kind of had to start having some of these conversations. And so I did the basic Epic course, mostly just so that when I went to my division chief, I could say, hey, there's nobody else in GI who's doing this. I could do it. And then I actually really, really liked it. And so then I did the rest of the courses, and now it's actually a part of my kind of job responsibility. So I have some effort set aside for doing kind of Epic physician building within the division. But that was not the initial intent. Was more that I just wanted to learn more about Epic and to be able to use it a little bit better. And then also maybe give a little kind of bonus points to my CV to say, hey, there's nobody here who's doing this. And so this is something I think that would add value. And it turns out I think it adds actually quite a bit of value.
That's awesome. There's another question in the chat, and it's asking about whether among systems that use Epic, can you access data from one at the other, which I think is talking about Epic Cosmos. And I'm not sure if that's something that you guys have at Cincinnati. We have it at OSU. So happy to have you answer it first, and then I can stab at it if you want.
Yeah. So there are. It depends on what exactly it is that you're talking about, but there are some shared data libraries between institutions that are maintained by Epic, and so So things like basic dashboard builds and that sort of stuff are available. And then other things. So one of the things that I do is I sit on the pediatric gastroenterology steering committee for Epic. So when they're making changes, they kind of ask us, and so it's a group of us from different institutions. And so some of the more recent builds have allowed for all gastroenterology data to be compared across institutions within Epic. So not all data, but some elements have been linked up so that you can actually look at other institutions and compare things. Like signal data, for example, is a good example of, you can actually compare yourself, as I said, to other divisions within your hospital, but you can also compare your division at Ohio State compared to Cleveland Clinic or whatever you wanted to compare it to, if they're in Epic. And so some of that does exist. I'm not sure if that answered your question, but
yeah, I think so. The only thing I know about Cosmos as a through Epic way to access data that's stored at other institutions is it's like a online platform. Each institution that participates in Cosmos agrees to send all of their data to Cosmos. And then there's a limited number of end users who have access to the platform. And I think per 10 users, you have to have one data scientist or some regulatory something to make sure that nobody's misusing it and just to keep tabs on it. And then in the platform, you're able to it just looks like slicer dicer to my eye. And you can just kind of look at numbers and trends and things like that. I haven't been able to enable a button that says download, but you can at least look at the numbers and get a sense of what's going on. I understand that there's a way to be able to download de-identified data once you do some additional training, and there's a specific Cosmos course that I imagine has to do with data safety. But that's the only thing that I'm aware of like that.
Yeah, so there's a couple of, yeah, so that's right. So there's a couple of things that are along those lines. And yeah, Cosmos is one of them. We don't participate in, so I haven't really messed with it, but we do something very similar, which is called PedsNet, which is a network of kind of 7 children's hospitals that all use Epic, and we share every single piece of data, so every image file, everything along those lines. And you similarly have to have special training, because of course not every version of Epic is exactly the same. So even when it's looking at similar data, it's not exactly the same. So the search features and queries are a little bit different, and so you actually have to build computational phenotypes for disease models that you want to look at, which sounds complicated, but it's not that hard. But it does add a level of complexity. But the plus side is you get 7 times the data from your own institution. So it is something that that we do mess around with. But as you kind of mentioned, Mitchell, we usually let our kind of informaticians or data scientists kind of do the driving on a lot of that, and we kind of feed them the questions, and then they say, okay, here's how you build that query appropriately, and then they send back the data.
Yeah. And then the last question in the chat: are you aware of any clinical projects that use data from all Epic users? Is that even possible? If you look at the Epic Cosmos site, particularly some of their more advertising kind of looking articles, it looks like they can pull from a high level from any of the Epic systems. And again, because it's through Cosmos, it's sites that have consented to submit their data to Cosmos to then be queried for research purposes. So that's the closest I've seen to something like that. I don't know, Peter, if you know of any other uses.
Yeah, I mean, the only one that I know of on the pediatric side, at least, is that kind of combined signal data, like we were talking about. So so there is a project that's ongoing where they combine Epic user, so specifically Epic user data across multiple institutions to look at things like we were talking about before, like time in notes, time in people are using for templates. But they can also do other things like reported, cecal intubation rates, and you can get different pieces of data, but those are based off of the users, not patient data, if that makes sense. So it's like, so the signal data is patient data, whereas PedsNet is the actual patient information. So it's kind of 2 separate tiers that we have access to on the pediatric side.
May I ask a quick question? Is that okay, Mitchell?
Yeah.
Peter,
What's up,
good to see
man?
you. Excellent. How's it going?
How are you? Long time no see. I like the
I'm
beard.
well. Thanks, man. Thanks. The wife does not like it, I'll tell you that. It's good to see you though, man. Excellent talk. So it's funny because I just finished my first phase project, so I'm hoping I can someday be like you. But I was wondering specifically with Slicer Dicer, have you taught yourself and are you using SQL then as that database sort of construct?
I haven't. I mean, I did a little bit, but I honestly I do most stuff in R, and I find that you can export to kind of the point that Mitchell is making. Downloading stuff from Slicer Dicer can sometimes be a little bit challenging, but you can export usually pretty reliably using a CSV extension. And at Children's, at least, you have to, like, that's where the IRB thing will come in. So there's no hard stop when you just like click on things within Slicer Dicer, but when you go to export it, it actually there's a pop-up that comes up that says, like, do you have meaningful use or do you meet meaningful use criteria? And one of the things is like an IRB kind of a checkbox thing. And then you can export it as a CSV. And so that's usually what I do. And then you can bring that into R pretty easily. And so I have largely kind of taught myself R over the last few years. Yeah, so that's usually what I use. But there is, as I mentioned, especially if you're interested more in diving deeper into the data and using Clarity and Caboodle in particular, if you're if SQL makes sense to you for whatever reason, it just never has really clicked with my brain. I don't really know why, but it always feels like very clunky for me to use it. And so, but if it makes sense for you, SQL is definitely a very good way to get into that to Clarity and Caboodle, which is the backbone of Slicer Dicer. So you can actually do even more robust and detailed searches using SQL, but I just have never gotten into it.
Okay, no, that's helpful. No, sorry. The reason I asked was because in that one slide, it looked as though, well, the top of the slide said SQL, and then it came down to Clarity and Caboodle. So that makes sense. That is essentially the backbone. But essentially, you're using whatever you've learned. So SAS, data, R, etc., to then
Right.
look up the CSV files to do your own coding to create your variables, etc., and then thereafter look into the data.
Yeah, and I skipped over some stuff, but there's some you can actually get into the kind of the source code of Epic, kind of the really behind the scenes stuff, and
Mhm.
so the original kind of Epic code is this like kind of bizarre like 1970s language, like it's very archaic, but you can do a lot there, and they've been slowly but surely updating, so they built a lot of the stuff around SQL, so a lot of what you see in Slicer Dicer is actually, again, the backbone is built on the Microsoft SQL kind of language and platform. So so if you're comfortable with SQL, there's a way that you can go straight into either Clarity or Caboodle and build out your own kind of queries and make that and skip that step and not have that frustration of like, oh, I can't find this one slice that I was looking for and that sort of stuff. Because I think that's probably the thing that turns the most people off about Slicer Dicer is they get 3/4 of the way into a project and like, I just want to look at this one last variable, but now I can't find it. And so and that's the benefit if you're comfortable doing your own SQL kind of programming. But usually in my situation, what I do then is then I go back to reporting Workbench and I bring things out that way, because then I can save that kind of forever, and then I can customize the column output. So if I wanted to look at ethnic demographic data or deprivation index or drug dosing, any of that sort of stuff, I can pull all of that in those columns, and then it's just there kind of forever. So
Okay, that makes sense. Awesome. Thank you
I'm
both
not, I'm not
again.
sure that that's the best way to do it, by the way. I'm not like that's just the way I do it.
No, I appreciate that insight though. That's huge. Thank you both a ton for this talk. Excellent talk, Peter.
Yeah, man.
In Peter, I've heard you mention the reporting workbench a couple of times. One of the challenges with a retrospective study is that it can be time intensive to go back and look up all the variables, and then maybe you have a trainee do it, and they're maybe not certain how to handle some of the variables, or there's some data checking. Have you used reporting workbench to like replace some of the columns in your data extraction, or do you still have folks go back manually and double check some things?
No, so I so I mean I use reporting workbench for our kind of a lot of times for our primary data pools, and so I kind of what we're just kind of talking about. So I'll use Slicer Dicer to kind of shape the data to get as close as I can to the kind of the core question, and then I'll use reporting workbench to get the really detailed information I want first, and then you can customize the report and add any additional kind of columns. So like in that autoimmune pancreatitis example, really the question was, could I find imaging that the keyword autoimmune pancreatitis shows up? And so that initially those were the only 3 columns, where the imaging study, the narrative, and the impression. And then you expand out and you say, okay, but what I also want is the name, the MRN, the sex, the ethnicity, the first date of diagnosis, and so you kind of start building things out from there, and then you can get all of that data that you really want. And so as you kind of said at the beginning, there's always potential flaws in retrospective data. It's always possible that patients can get missed, but if you start with a relatively narrow question, then you can get to that data pretty well, and then you can expand out the data from there and get more data about those patients that you've identified. And sometimes that does mean, looking a couple different ways to make sure that you're getting all of the data, and we certainly will do that as well. We might run several reports, and then and the beauty of then reporting, of copying things into CSV format, is then you can eliminate duplicates. And so if you run, say, 3 reports just to be on the safe side, then you can export them all and then eliminate the duplicates and end up with a pretty robust list.
That's really awesome, and sounds like a robust way of making sure that you've captured all the people that have been seen in your institution, and it definitely makes a robust method, I think. Sounds like.
And you can do it, like, the other thing I like about it is you can do it kind of in the background. Like, I can start one of these reports at the start of clinic, and it might take 2 hours to run because it's it's a lot of data that it's running through. But then at the end of clinic, then I have that report, and then I just save it, and then I can look at it, and it just runs in the background while I'm doing my other work. And so it's very kind of efficient. Like, and I don't have to like email somebody and set up a meeting to potentially look at Epic in 6 months when they have time and that sort of stuff. Like, you can do it. You can literally do it in the middle of patient care, and still be providing good patient care.
Awesome. Well, Peter, thanks so much for your time. This has been really exciting to me because I'm just brimming with ideas about what we might do with our medical record that I didn't think was possible before until you mentioned some of these tools. So thanks so much for joining us and for sharing your expertise with us. This will be posted online, so I'll circulate it around, and I may reach out to you in the future with more questions or for guidance.
Yeah, anytime.
Awesome. Well, thanks again so much, and we'll wrap it up there.